made resolutions to listen to more new music in 2023. Boy, have we got you covered. Hello and welcome back to Meet Mozart. I'm Angie, and that's Mozart, but enough with old dead guys. It's 2023, so today we are going to be focusing on the music of a really wonderful and very much alive composer, Bob AKA Robert Chamberlin. I was really blessed to get to have Bob as a professor of mine at Webster University, where I did my undergrad. And besides being just a gem of a human being and a brilliant music theorist, Bob is also a great composer with a really wide-ranging output, going all the way from church music, such as hymn arrangements and chorales, to orchestral music, small instrumental ensembles, art songs, and much more. And lucky for us, a large portion of that music is available on Sheet Music Plus and Sheet Music Direct, so I highly encourage you all to go and check that out. The pieces we're going to be taking a look at today were inspired by moi and Mozart, so I'm really thrilled to get to share them with you and to have Bob actually get to tell you a little bit more about them. One quick note before we get started: usually when we do these longer form videos, we go ahead and break it down into two parts. So we'd have the interview as part one and then the music as part two, but the YouTube algorithm doesn't seem to be such a big fan of that. So we're gonna go ahead and include everything on this one video. If you're really in a hurry and you just wanted to get to hear the music, I'm gonna go ahead and put some timestamps in the comments below so you can do that. But I really, really hope you all will watch the entire interview, because as we're going to discuss, the better that you understand a composer, what inspired them to write a piece, how they work, what their process is, the more you are going to get out of listening to that piece of music. So I hope you'll take the time to do that, and let's get started. Hello, Bob. Welcome to Meet Mozart.
Well, I'm glad to be here. Hello, Mozart, and hello, Angie.
It's really great to have you. I'm really excited to get to hear a little bit about you and a little bit about your music. And I'm really excited that after our interview, I get to share some of that music, a very special piece that was the first piece ever written for me to sing. So that was really exciting and special. And we'll talk about that a bit. But I'd love to hear a little bit about you and your work, anything you want us to know.
Well, I'll try and be really short and brief here, but music is my life, and it's started early. I won't dwell on the kids' stuff too much, but I started piano when I was 6, and I started writing when I was 6. And it's been all additive since then, lots of things coming along. And as far as me wanting to write, that's gone up and down when I was younger, but as I got older, it became a passion. And it was something where I needed to have a sense of communication with what I wrote. I wanted to feel like there was somebody listening, there was somebody performing. I didn't want to just write music just for the sake of writing music. And sometimes that happens, like you get to be a theorist and you say, ooh, that's a fun pattern. I think I'll play with that. And oh, look, I've got a whole symphony here that nobody will ever play. That can happen, but I didn't want that. So most of my direction in writing music has been to write for people that I know, to write for occasions, to write stories and try and retell the story so somebody might be interested in a different way. If somebody would ask me to write a piece of music, I was ready to fly if I could do it. So the result of that is that the body of music that I've composed throughout my life, most of it has been performed because I wrote it to be performed, and that's the great thing. And it's also a lot of variety. If somebody asks me, what style is your music? I can't give a straight answer, because I've done avant-garde experimental techniques. I've written a lot of music for church choirs and church organ, because that's part of my profession too. I've written a lot of music for theater, for dance. How do you pinpoint a style? You just say, there's all this body, go listen, you decide what you'd like. But I will insert one thing in the midst of all that. When I put on a recital just a few years before I retired, In 2013, I put on a big concert at Christ Church Cathedral of just my music, and I put a whole variety there. And it didn't hit me until then, in putting it together, that there were common expressions and there were certain things that stuck out musically in every piece that I say, there's that motive again. I do have some kind of a thread coming through here, and I never thought about it until then. I just wrote and did it and hoped for the best, of course. But that's when I discovered that, oh, it is possible to have a theme or themes that provide some continuity, whether it's somebody dancing on a roof and belting, or somebody sitting placidly behind a pipe organ playing something like a simple hymn. There were commonalities between the two. So
how would you describe some of those commonalities? Because that really struck me too when I was going through. I know you have a lot of great music that you've put up on sheet music, and there's some good recordings. And I was going through just trying to get, you know, a grasp of more of the body of your work, and I felt the same way. I was like, how do I describe what this is? Because you've done so many different things for voice, for instruments, you know, and so I'm curious to know how could you describe some of the common threads that you notice were working through that?
Well, I'll pull one out first because it applies directly to the tuba pieces that I wrote for you. That there is a theme, or a motive, I should say a motive, that appears in just about everything I've written somewhere. And I call it the "Where Are You" motive. It's an ascending minor seventh followed by a descending minor third. And you got to sing that in the tuba pieces, and I got to play it on the piano. But I never thought about it until I said, oh, there's that "Where Are You" motive. And then I look at other pieces and say, there it is again. There it is again. And, you know, putting the words "Where are you" with it I'm not trying to be programmatic to say that that's what I was thinking when I wrote that motive and it got into the pieces. It's not that it was telling me what to write, that the "Where are you" is just that it sounds like somebody saying, "Where are you?" And in a funny sort of way, and an ironic way, it makes sense too, because one of the questions that I've asked myself all along is, what's next? When I'm done writing a piece of music, okay, that's over, what's next? And I used to tell my composition students to remember to ask themselves, what's next? Don't ever stop. Just keep asking what's next. And do that with your life. Don't do it just with music. What's next? And composing in the big frame. So the "Where are you" is so appropriate in a way that, well, what's next? And the Vocalise for tuba and soprano and piano, that ends with the "Where are you" motive.
Right.
There it is. But I never thought about it until 8 years ago. You know?
But that's so cool. So that's kind of it's great because it seems to be like just an internal mantra that keeps speaking its way through your music. That's really wonderful.
And it keeps telling me that I don't really know where I am. I just keep doing it.
Well, I think, you know, I had mentioned when we kind of planned this whole thing of, you know, one of the things that I love about doing this channel is that, you know, first of all, I get to sing what I want to sing and stuff, but I also get to feature people that I really want to feature. And I think you were, whether you knew it or not, were a very profound presence in my time at Webster. And with, you know, you have such a wonderful playfulness that's part of your music and part of your personality. And I love that "Where are you? What next?" kind of idea. That seems to make so much sense for who I have gotten to experience you as a person.
Well, thank you. And I hope you always ask yourself, what's next?
Oh, I never know what's next.
That's why you have to ask. Well, let me jump to one other thought too. There is something that I actually do consciously put into a number of my pieces and have all along the way. Sometimes it actually does slip in accidentally, but I've always liked wordplay, as you know.
Yes.
And one of the kinds of wordplay I really like is to use palindromes, where
Mhm.
you say something that's the same backwards and forwards, like my name, Bob.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and you know, luckily I get to be dad too. Anyway, so palindromes can be expressed musically too. This
Right.
takes a little bit of effort, and so this isn't something that slips into the music like Where Are You? But
Mhm.
I've composed a number of pieces that can be played backwards and they'll sound the same. One of the pieces that I really had fun with was a fanfare for trumpet and trombone
Mhm.
that I wrote. Oh, I don't know what year it was, but it was Webster years, you know. But anyway, I just decided I want to write a palindrome for these two instruments, and I want it bright and fast and lively. I thought, well, let's have a little bit of fun. Let's not just have it completely note for note backwards and forwards, but let's add a complexity to it. So the complexity was that I made it into a canon so
Ah.
that each one of the instruments does the same palindrome at a different pitch range. So their imitation is at the third. Well, what happens then is that when you get to the midpoint of the starting instrument's palindrome, the following instrument hasn't reached its midpoint yet. And
Right.
one instrument ends before the other. And if you play that backwards, you still have the same notes and rhythms backwards and forwards,
Mhm.
but the imitating instrument now is the starting instrument and it
Right.
starts lower than the first. So I wasn't completely content with that.
Uh-huh.
So I wrote it out backwards and attached it to the first one so that it actually does, when you play both versions back to back, it actually does sound exactly the same. The one thing that I wanted to make sure happened with this particular fanfare, since it was going to be so strict as a canon and as a palindrome, I wanted the tempo to be very strict too. No retards, no vibrato, nothing to rubato, nothing to change the essence that this is something that's clicking along and it's got to be constant. And I wanted it really fast. So the tempo, and here's my own little wordplay. The tempo for this piece is presto no changeo. Hit it and don't change.
I love that. I think that's half of the fun of singing and making new music is that every composer now has their own language for those kinds of markings, and it can be like very comical what people are asking people to do. Like forget about, largo, andante. We're done with those. We're moving on to specific emotions and thought processes and exactly how you should feel in the moment that you play this note.
Right. And in contemporary scores, if you look at a lot of the recently composed music in the last couple decades, you'll see that happening, particularly with English speaking composers. I don't know about other countries whether so
Mm,
much of that happens. I haven't taken time to look,
right.
but you'll see things like play as if you don't really want to play this. You'll see stuff like that where it's throwing a challenge at the performer. It's not just here's your tempo, but you have to present a psychological attitude when you play this.
Yeah, which is a fascinating way that music has evolved, And I was just doing a concert with a friend of mine where we talk about classical music, and especially art song. And he's like going through like the evolution to like romanticism because that's like a huge, burst of art song in the romantic era, and just this realization of how like during that romantic period we were sort of having a different artistic understanding of the self and this nature mapping and all of this stuff. And now we're at have emotions as you play a singular note. Like just this whole movement through time of human expression. And the more we expect for music and a musician to be able to express.
Right. One of my favorite indications in any score is something Chopin wrote. And I
Mm.
don't think he's the only person that did stuff like this, and I don't think it's the only piece, the one that I noticed it on by him. But in one of his nocturnes, it's a single page long, and you get to the bottom of the page, and it says DC or da capo,
Mhm.
dal segno,
Mhm.
senza fine. Now, what does that mean?
Just keep going?
That means it never ends. He put that at the end of the piece, senza fine.
Well, someone must have stopped playing it. I'm not still hearing it.
Right. It's been performed many times and recorded, and there is a stop point. But and usually people just go back to the beginning and then end it like that.
Right.
But the fact that he put that in there was a nice little tongue in cheek, the
Right.
song is never ended, as Irving Berlin said,
Right.
song is never over. Yeah. So I want to switch the gears a little bit here if I could, because palindrome actually made me think of this. One of the most fun pieces I ever had writing, had a chance to write, was when a friend of mine who's a murder mystery author asked me to compose music based on one of her murder mysteries.
Oh, interesting.
And she had been doing this all along. She's got quite a collection of stories she's written over time. And when I was still teaching, she'd always ask me, will you write some music? Because I want to put a CD out with the book of music to accompany my book.
Oh,
And
wow.
I always begged off and said, sounds like fun, but I'm really pretty busy here at WebU. And I don't have the time, but I always found somebody to do the job for her. So I don't know if you were in classes with Lola Haneke, for instance, but she was a student who's a jazz singer, and she's out in California now making her way. And she also writes songs and a lot of things. And I said, this story needs a certain kind of soprano or singer voice here. Because number one, the title of the piece was Torch Song. And so I said, Lola, you're a bit of a torch singer, and maybe you could write a torch song. And she put her head to it. And anyway, so book after book, I kept tapping other people. So why don't you write for this author? Why don't you write for this? After I retired, the author called me and she said, you can't say no now. You don't work there anymore. So she corralled me, and I wrote music for a book called Arrested Flight.
Yeah.
And I read some of the first drafts that she wrote, got a flavor of the whole thing. And the result of it was that I came up with 4 character pieces, and I wrote them for 2 pianos. And because one of the characters was a piano player, so I wanted piano to be the instrument. And so the 4 character pieces, were based on characters or scenes from the story. So there's Lily's song, for instance, because Lily was the fiance of the musician that was murdered, and so she's a central character in the story. But the most fun piece that I wrote out of that, all through the story, there are fairies that have roles. They appear in different situations. These fairies are fleeting around. So one of the pieces is called The Fairies. I said, how do I express fairies in music? Yeah. What do you do? There are these little things flitting around. So that's what I wanted the music to sound like. Little things flitting around with something that sounds like they have no purpose other than to flit around. So the answer was create that kind of atmosphere with the notes themselves, write it as a palindrome, and write it as a canon between the 2 pianos. And I put a lot of stops and starts. So there's a lot of rests with fermatas over them. There's even grace notes with fermatas over the grace note.
Oh, interesting.
Just to throw a little extra shot. How long do I hold this grace note? But just to make it sort of unreal in a way.
Yeah.
And there's this big flurry of activity in the middle when they all reach their big climactic moment, and then it tapers off and goes back to lots of rests and grace notes and things. Well, the fun part of this is that I had Donna Vince and Pat Eastman premiere it, and I think you remember them.
Yes, of course, yeah.
Right, and they did a fantastic job. They really nailed the piece. Well, in their rehearsals, it suddenly occurred to them that when they were doing the gestures for the fairies, they would hit a note and there would be a rebound of their hand. And then there'd be a rest and a rebound and a rest. and I think it was Donna maybe that got the idea, but it could have been Pat, that, well, why don't we just toss the fairy to each other? Since they were imitating each other, they do the rebound and then toss the fairy and catch the fairy and throw it back. And so they were throwing fairies at each other through the whole piece. And when it got to the last notes, Donna did the last rebound, and she caught the fairies and she turned to the audience and she threw the fairies out over the audience. I couldn't have written it better myself. I mean, that was not written into the score. It just emerged as a thing. And Donna said, I hope, are you okay with this? I said, absolutely.
Yeah.
Do it. Overdo it. Yeah. So those are some of the best moments when you interact with a performer and the performer brings their own ideas and they work too, and you let it grow into something you didn't even imagine at the beginning.
Yeah. Yeah, and I feel like that must be such a process and something that can go either very good or very wrong, right? That as a composer, you've worked on this piece, you've created this special thing, it's kind of your baby, and then ultimately you have to usually give it to someone else, and either they take that and they create something, that you think is just better than what you could have come up with, or, maybe you're sitting there going, oh, this is not what I meant. But I was just wondering, you know, when you give your piece to people, how do you feel about the stuff that they do a lot of the time? Is it like nail biting or, go and do your thing?
Both. There are nail biting moments, and there are times that I wonder how I might have done it differently so that I didn't get that result.
Mm-hmm.
What did I do wrong? And I can't always nail down what that is. But people do take their own sensibilities into interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
And they may be doing exactly what you've put on the printed page as they envision it.
Right.
And you can't control that. So at a certain point, if you're composing music, you have to be willing to let go because, well, I mean, you're just not going to be around all the rest of the world as it moves on. You can't watch every performance, and you just say, there it is, world, do what you do with it. Have fun.
Right.
When you're working with forms that are strict, like the strict palindrome or a strict canon,
Mm-hmm.
you hope that the form retains its integrity. But if the performer can do something with that and make it their own, like Donna and Pat did by throwing fairies out at the audience,
Right.
all the better.
Right.
So it can work both ways.
What would you rather hear? Them working really hard to try to play everything exactly the way that you wrote it, or them taking your piece, and taking what's on the page, respecting what's on the page, but letting kind of their own experience flow through it? What would you rather see? Oh,
The second one.
the second one.
If they're not putting something of their own into it, then I'd have to say, what's the point? And I mean, the notations are guidelines and instructions to help get to the point where hopefully you feel comfortable enough to make it your own.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that every piece of music by every composer should be that way. I can't speak for other composers. In fact, I happen to have met a composer along the way who really just didn't care if anybody played his music.
Mm.
He was just having fun doing it, and he'd write these really heavy mathematical compositions that were really intriguing theoretically.
Right.
And I'd point out, I don't think anybody can play that. I think that's impossible. He said, I don't care. That wasn't his goal. So
Right.
I'm not saying bad boy or anything. It's just that's what his thing in music was to write stuff that way and play with form and structure. And he didn't care if it went beyond him. So, but I'd prefer to have something that's shared and people learn and make their own. So
Right. Absolutely. I like that answer. As a performer who I'm sure never gets anyone's instructions entirely right in the first place.
there's another thing to throw out on your question. There is music that is little black dots and lines on a white page with instructions and follow my directions. But then there's chance, taking things for chance and aleatoric music. And I've done my share of that. I've got a number of pieces that are I call prose scores. There's no printed notes. It's just instructions.
Oh, wow.
And this is not unique to me.
Right.
There's a whole history of composers writing prose scores. And so I've written a number of scores where, okay, here's what this group does, and here's what this group does now. Read your instructions and do it. And then there's a whole lot of room for latitude. One piece I did that was a prose score at Webster, we did in Winifred Moore Auditorium. You remember that place?
Yeah, of course. Many memories.
And it was, what did I call it? I'm trying to remember what I call it. Anyway, I had 20 people who were whistlers.
Oh, wow.
And they were just supposed to wander through the audience whistling whatever they wanted to in a very nonchalant way. And they were instructed not to interact with the audience at all. Just wander around whistling. And while they were doing that, there was another student dressed up as an old woman sitting in a rocking chair, just rocking at the front. And another person was playing a bowl gong. And in the balcony, a bunch of us were playing handheld percussion. And then there were two guys playing didgeridoos.
Oh, wow.
In the balcony. And their instructions were, play what you want, but gradually get out of the balcony and wander through the audience. And don't make eye contact with the audience. Just walk through the audience playing your didge. And then disappear through the front doors, the exits. Wow. And as the whistlers moved through the audience, they carried presents to the woman in the chair. And they handed her presents and gave her hugs. And she collected all her presents and kept rocking. And pretty soon the piece is over and the didge players disappeared and the whistlers disappeared and the bowl gong players stopped and everything just stopped, and that was it. All I did was write out 2 pages of instructions. Whistlers, do this. Woman in chair, do this. Didge players, do this. Right. I didn't feel like I could put together a musical score that told what needed to be done. And I had perfect confidence that the people doing it would just follow the instructions and it would become their own way, their own little piece.
Yeah. Well, can I ask, what was your inspiration? Because I think I remember this very distinctly. I don't think it was your class, but somewhere in Webster, or I mean, maybe it was Earl Henry. And he had written down like a definition of what is music, right? And the definition was organized sound. That's all they could come up with. And so, you know, when you're writing a piece that's prose music like that, right? That's so, you know, ad lib and freely done, and not, you know, someone playing this note at this time so that it sounds a certain way. Like, what's the inspiration behind approaching things that way?
Well, for that particular piece, I just wanted to create an atmosphere and draw people into a story that was emerging. And I wasn't totally in charge of how the story would emerge, but there was one constant factor for me, that the woman in the chair was Whistler's mother, rocking in her rocking chair, and her children were greeting her and giving her things. Right. And that was in my mind. But I didn't come out and say, by the way, you're about to experience the painting Whistler's Mother as I envision it as a story.
Right.
I wanted it more mysterious or whatever. But there was one audience member that came up to me afterwards and said, I got it. That was Whistler's mother. I said, thank you.
That's great. Well, I love it because it's performance. It becomes more performance art even than like music in the traditional sense. But I love that it was part of bringing a actual painting to life. That's fabulous.
Oh, I did remember the title. And the title has nothing to do with Whistler's mother. It's just called Processional. Because there are a bunch of people wandering around processing.
Right. Well, Why didgeridoo?
Well, I knew two people who could play didgeridoo pretty well, and one of them was a music student, and one was a personal friend who had retired, and he was building his own didgeridoos and just having fun, and he wasn't a trained musician. And I said, how would you like to perform in a university recital? Oh yeah, okay. so so again, I like to write for people and bring them in, and things have more meaning that way, I think.
Well, and that is, a question that I wanted to ask. Things are kind of inspired by people, right? So, we can tell our story, right? That I played tuba in high school, and I had my tuba chick 04 email address, and I had to email you to ask you a question, and all of a sudden these pieces are born, right? But just knowing me and knowing that I play tuba, and maybe hearing me sing is not enough to like write a piece. So like, how do you go about choosing what kind of piece you want to write for, you know, a saxophone player versus a tuba player versus a piano and soprano, and what inspires you to take a direction with a piece?
Okay, you just asked a whole bunch of questions
Yeah, I'm sorry.
wrapped up into just a few questions. But first of all, inspiration is tough to nail. What is that anyway? I tend to think of inspiration as taking a breath in, because you're inspiring. And hopefully if you breathe in, you have something that will inspire somebody else, and hopefully create a moment for them to take a breath too. So that's my broad definition of inspiration. Don't want to go any further than that.
Okay.
But here's the nuts and bolts. Before I wrote a single note of your pieces or anybody else's pieces, what are the parameters? What are my limitations?
Mhm.
Oh, okay, Angie's a soprano. Okay, the range of a tuba is from here to here. Oh, Angie probably sings better than she plays tuba. Just a guess. But you had told me it had been a number of years since you'd put one up to your mouth and played it.
Yeah.
So just to guess it, okay, don't make the tuba part overly demanding, but go for it with the voice.
Mhm.
Let it blossom.
Yeah.
Um, Also, if I'm writing for one person to sing and play and make it any musical sense out of it, be sure I time things right so you can get the instrument up to your lips and away from your lips, and a chance to breathe the way you have to breathe to sing, which is different than the way you breathe to play tuba. And I know you got some coaching from Jim Martin on how to breathe and
Mhm.
embouchure and all that. So all those parameters had to be in my mind before a single note was written.
Mhm.
And sometimes I take a legal pad and I just write everything down. Here's what I'm dealing with. And it's very structured thought process.
Mhm.
Um, Once that's over, then I try to imagine, what do I want it to sound like?
Mhm.
And sometimes the answer comes up by just going to a piano and sitting down and playing.
Mm.
And sometimes that's not the answer. Sometimes the answer comes at awkward moments.
Right.
Um, I've had, not with your pieces, but I've had ideas for pieces suddenly come to mind and bear some fruit while I'm actively performing something else.
Mm.
And I can't, it's hard to split your mind. You can't stop your live performance and say, excuse me, I need to write this down. But sometimes things happen that way. And so it's unpredictable. And so that's where I'm not sure how to answer part of your question. But knowing what you've got to work with,
Right.
and then just letting the ideas flow.
Right. Well, and I think that's why probably your body of work is so widespread and does so many things.
Well, something that's helped develop a sense of variety for me to write with was being involved with theater,
Mm-hmm.
because most of my involvement with theater productions has been the director of the production saying, in this play, I want some of my cast who are musicians to perform songs as part of the play.
Mm.
And then I'd find out who the musicians were and what parts they were playing and what text from the play the director would want me to write music to for them to sing while they're on stage. So
Mhm.
this is not providing a pit orchestra or background sound effects or anything else, but it's like actually getting involved with the actors and then having to teach them how to sing something brand new
Right.
to lines that maybe they learned once before in a different setting. And they're doing this play a second or third time, but now I have to learn this music with it too.
Right.
Oh, so that ended up in me working a lot with Shakespeare
Mhm.
productions. And so in Midsummer Night's Dream, I actually had the occasion to write music for two different productions of Midsummer Night's Dream, which means there are two fairy songs when the
Mhm.
fairies are singing Philomel. And so there's this one version I wrote for that production, and there's this whole other fairies song that I wrote for that production. and it ended up being, well, who are the people again? And what can they do? What can't they do?
Right,
And
right.
so working in theater has helped me broaden my own palette, if you will.
How much of your music is really storytelling then? Like, for example, that prose piece that you mentioned has this, very specific image in mind. And how much of that is underlying your music, and what's your thought process in working that in?
Well, I think most of my music is programmatic, at least to me.
Mhm.
It may not be an obvious program to the listener, but that I'm operating with a story or something behind it.
Mhm.
But there's a fair amount of things that I've written that have no program. It's simply an expression of music.
Mhm.
So when I wrote that palindromic canon for two brass instruments, there's no story there.
Right.
It's playing with structure and form
Mhm.
and having fun with it. And that's all that was.
Yeah.
Whereas the palindrome canon for the fairies, there's a story behind that one. So sometimes there's a story, sometimes there isn't. And as a trained music theorist, I love playing with form and structure.
Mhm.
And I can get down in the middle of something so heavily that a lot of times musicians would say, just stop talking. Don't tell me about that part of it. I just want to learn my part. I don't want to know what you were thinking when you wrote that. Alan Larson, the Webster Symphony director and my colleague for years,
Yes.
I would start talking in numbers about something I was writing for the orchestra.
Uh-huh.
Say, stop. I don't want to hear numbers. I don't want to hear your number games. I just want to get the score and learn it.
Well, I think that's a very legitimate thing, which is one thing that I wanted to chat with you a bit about is, you know, I think we can get trapped in really, I mean, and you are a great music theorist and I am not, but from that angle, you can get very, very into that and you can see all these intricacies of what's going on with the theory and the structure and have these games that you're playing that, if you are also a great music theorist, you could listen to those things and like pick out all those things and really grasp it all. But how do you ever find it difficult to make those things translate to people who maybe don't have much background in music, and how hard is it for people to come into those kinds of pieces and still be able to get everything out of it even if you don't really understand music theory that well?
There's a challenge there. And when I approach writing, I want the theory to be solid and I want it to make perfect sense in my mind. And I
Mhm.
want to be able to look for those nuances that are only theoretical and that an average listener and even a trained music average listener
Mhm.
may not get, but they don't have to. The whole point is the theory drives the process for me.
Mhm.
It helps shape what I hope is something that somebody else can listen to and in their own framework, give it their own shape and make it their own. They don't have to know all the theory.
Right.
And just to press that point, one of the pieces that I wrote for the Webster Orchestra that Dr. Larson asked me to write for the orchestra, when I wrote it, I thought, well, I'm just going to have some fun here. This is where he wanted me to stop talking. He and I were hired the same year. We started at Webster the same year, and that year, believe it or not, a long time ago, was 1973.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, how old were you? No, never mind.
Don't ask.
So I just decided I was going to write the entire piece based on the numbers 7 and 3 and see how many different ways I could manipulate 7 and 3 to create the music.
Uh-huh.
There are a lot of seventh chords and intervals of sevenths and intervals of thirds.
Uh-huh.
There are polymeters and mixed meters where 7 goes against 3 and 7/8 becomes 3/8. I just played with 7 and 3 until it exhausted me, and then the piece was over. That's all I can do is 7 and 3. Done.
What's the piece called?
Dances, refrains, and a song of hope.
Nothing to do with sevens or threes.
No.
No.
So there was the first dance, and there was a refrain, and there was a second dance, and then it was followed by the same refrain. So the repeating refrain was connecting the movements, and a third dance, and a refrain. And after the refrain, the whole mood just changes. The dances were sort of upbeat, sprightly, and weird in a way. But the Song of Hope became the longest movement and was just a gradual evolution from single notes to a huge, big cadence at the end, where the string players reach all the notes of a 13th chord. Mm. So for all you theorists out there, it's 13th chord, which is 3 + 3 + 7. Anyway, when they get to the 13th chord, that's the last chord of the piece, and there is no resolution. They're playing it fortissimo for 10 measures, just sustaining it, and it killed the string players to just keep the pressure on the bow and keep the sound coming. And I remember Alan just trying to pull it out of him, and so then it just cuts off fortissimo after this long 13th chord. And I didn't want resolution to that piece. If you think about what hope is, it's your hope for something.
Right.
It hasn't happened yet.
I love that.
The audience, the written program notes say nothing about 7 and 3. That would distract the listener.
Right, right. But to be able to play with those things in a way that is, pleasing to your theorist mind, right? And fun for you as a composer, but to also have something that reads to the audience no matter what they know about sevenths and thirds and all of that. I think that's the biggest goal, right? Is to get to have that creative part and fulfill that with the knowledge that you have, but then also use it to actually communicate something.
Well, and if somebody hears a piece that I wrote and they come to me and they say, I want to know more about how you put that together. Mm-hmm. Okay, knock on the door. Okay, I'll open it. Let's talk music theory.
Right.
And we can do that. And just as a little side note to that particular set of pieces, if you go on Sheet Music Plus, only the Song of Hope is there. I decided that the dances and the refrains, they're sort of expendable. They were just sort of icing on the cake, a big setup for now's the big moment. And so I just wanted Song of Hope to stand alone as a piece.
Hope remains, right?
Something like that. I have to go back on one thing you said earlier, just real quickly. When you said being asked the question, what is music?
Yeah.
Now, you are acquainted with John Cage, who John Cage was.
Oh, yeah, of course, yeah.
Right, and master of chants and everything. Well, He avoided aesthetics all the time. He did not want any aesthetic response or responsibility to anything.
Mm.
And whenever anybody asked him, what is music? His answer was always work. And that's all he would say. And, you can't argue with that because it takes work to make music.
Yeah.
But for him, music was work.
Wow.
And he said, what you just experienced today in the concert hall was my work.
Mm. Would you describe music that way or your music that way?
No, and I don't know how I would,
Mm.
but I'm a Cage fan,
Mhm.
and he gave me that answer. In fact, when I had seen a performance of his
Mhm.
and talked to him right after the performance, I said, when you were doing this, and this on stage and interacting with the dancers and doing this, I asked him, I said, was that in any way related to the number 8,
Mm.
which comes from the I Ching, which is a Chinese book of fortune that he consulted frequently? And he
Mhm.
just stared at me. He said, well, and he was doing this piece with David Tudor and Merce Cunningham.
Mm.
And he looked at me very straight face. He said, well, Merce did his work. David did his work. I did my work. And now you are doing your work. That was it.
Wow.
I'll never forget that conversation.
Wow.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Cage. I'll be on my
Yeah.
way.
Yeah, right? I mean, that's a really distinct way of thinking of the whole process. That's really fascinating. But yeah, I don't know. Maybe again it's knowing you, but I have a feeling with you, this is my play. I played this way, they played that way, and now you are going to play with all of these ideas in your mind as the
Right.
audience.
Right.
I'm putting words into your mouth, sorry.
You're not off base.
Good.
The flip side to that question, what is music,
Mhm.
is a question that I did ask in my classes. I'd
Mm.
ask, what is noise? Which can be very complicated to answer because
Yeah.
the tendency of music people, music students, music professionals say noise. Well, noise is something that doesn't belong. It's an
Mm.
unwanted sound. And
Mm.
so I always throw back at them, well, in biblical times when the psalmist said, make a joyful noise, what were they saying? What was being said there? What's a joyful noise if it's something that's unwanted? It's complicated. And then if you talk to somebody on acoustic level, well, noise is a band of frequencies that interact in a certain way and create opposing frequency. And acousticians get off on these, this is noise.
Yeah.
And so it's a hard thing to answer, as is what is music.
Yeah. And there's so many ways to express that music or noise or whatever you want to call it. But as long as we have I guess it's about having the sharing and creating an experience for everyone to have with
Sure.
whatever noise, music, whatever you want to call it, is at hand.
Well, that you said an important word, shared experience.
Mhm.
Music gives the most opportunity for shared experience that I can imagine.
Yeah. Agreed.
The audience, the performers, composers, it's one big shared experience. And that to me is at the heart of it there.
Right. One shared moment and then it's gone.
Mhm. So now what? What's next?
Yeah. Well, and I wanted to ask you too because you have, we've talked a lot about your composition and those ideas. But you also were a professor for a very long time. And I just wonder, what kind of thoughts you have or what ideas you wanted to share that you shared with your students through the years that you think are important.
Well, that's really a tough thing, because a lot of times teaching for me was not, in my mind, it wasn't spitting something out in the hopes that you can spit it back.
Mm-hmm.
Where, watch the students take the notes so they can take the test and as close as possible say what I said, or say what the book said. I've never felt teaching was that. Now, I think hearing what somebody says and assimilating it, and again, making it your own, but being able to express it with some sort of confidence that you understand it.
Mm-hmm.
That if a teacher is going to succeed, hopefully it's in getting a student to the point where they feel confident with what they're learning.
Right.
And that's much more important than what the data is that they're learning. Now, I'd have people argue with me on that. Doctors in training to be physicians.
Mm-hmm.
I've got to know the data. Well, yeah, I mean, and I don't mean to cut hairs too finely here, but I think one of the biggest smiles for me in retirement is when I hear of a former student succeeding in doing something that I remember thinking, I sure hope they go that way. I
Mm.
sure hope that works for them. And then when it does, and I think a lot of teachers would agree with me, is watching former students excel and do their thing and hopefully encourage others to grow up and do their thing is a big thing.
Right.
Like you.
we're we're working on it here. We're trying.
Well, we'll see, and see that's part of it. You don't say no, you don't stop. You
Mhm.
do say what's next, and you keep at it, and you make things work, and you click. Oh, I
Yeah.
mean, I love the fact when I see a student doing something that you're going to have to teach me how to do that now.
Right.
Like if somebody said to me, set up a Zoom meeting and do this editing and do what you're doing, I need somebody to guide me through the process. I have no idea what you're doing.
Neither
I'm
do
happy to be on this end talking.
I. Well, you're good company. Neither do I. Or we're making it all up as we go along.
Right. So, the other part of teaching, and besides hoping that students assimilate and make something their own and grow with it, is that you do have to be sort of, I mean, I always thought teaching was a little bit in loco parentis. I didn't want to be the parent, especially at the college level,
Right.
but there were times I had to.
Right.
And those usually were disciplinary moments,
Right.
which thankfully were few and far between.
Right.
Um, but, and then I'd have to figure out, what am I doing here? And you're distracting from the learning. If something would come up in a class that distracted from the learning, that's when I felt that I had to do something about that
Right.
as quickly as possible so that the learning could continue. And sometimes you just have to do it, but at the college level, that is really infrequent, at least my experience.
Right. People are there because they want to be. Well, and I would think that's something too, if we talk about the larger like music education, especially at the college level where you're teaching people who are wanting to do this professionally, you know, I feel like there's always a little difficulty between, you know, how do you teach someone something that is ultimately, their own creative process?
Well, this is where you get into the musicological side too. That you just listened to a piece of music and you told me that you didn't like it.
Mhm.
Now, tell me in musical terms why you don't like it. That's one thing.
Mhm.
But now let's explore that composer's life. What time period, what was happening in that composer's world?
Right.
Let's understand where it came from. Let's do everything we can to understand what's behind the music. And if in the end you still don't like it, that's okay. You've made an aesthetic judgment, but you've made it on informed opinion. And I think when you sing Mozart or Puccini or whoever, you're not just singing the notes on the page. You're singing what you know is happening in the evolution of the story when that was written, if it's an opera.
Right.
And you know who these composers were. What were their lives like, you know?
Right.
Because Puccini and Mozart are miles apart in terms of living experiences and environment.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of melody, in a way, they're not that far apart.
Right.
And then you, as a trained singer, you've trained your voice to do things in the right way and to interpret. And you can look at notes and say, this is what I have to do with this because Mozart wrote it.
Right.
You have to put a little bit of Mozart into it.
Right.
Tuba Mirum that you sang and played tuba on.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, there was the joke with the word tuba and playing a tuba with it. But the opening motive is from Mozart's Tuba Mirum, which is a part of the Dies Irae in his Requiem.
Right.
And if you put it all in context and you look at the notes that I wrote on the page and the expression that I'm trying to give to it, you know, first of all, that I'm not writing a Tuba Mirum in the conventional sense. A lot of the text is not there.
Right.
And you also know that this is not a part of a day of wrath and a reckoning.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But you may pick up the fact that there's some question marks
Mm-hmm.
that will go unanswered. And where are you? Or where are, yeah, that motive.
Right.
Where am I?
Who am I? Where am I? What day is it?
There's one of the questions, and it emerges out of the texture.
Right.
And so anyway, but you have to think, but Mozart started this with that motive.
Right. Well, I think you make it a very important point, not just in terms of, well, in terms of music appreciation, I guess, in general,
Mhm.
because I feel like there are so many people that struggle to tap into classical music because we have a culture that doesn't focus on it anymore. And so a lot of people are coming into it as outsiders and they're hearing things and just deciding, like you said, I like it, I don't like it. And then that's it. And so often it's really understanding everything that's going around that piece. And it's important not just for understanding Mozart and why Mozart did all the things that he did, but also for understanding Bob and why Bob is doing the things that he's doing, because this historical aspect of the music is still very much a part of the new music that's coming out. And so the greater knowledge that you have, the more music that you've listened to, the easier it's going to be for you to tap into a new music experience and really be able to pull something out of it.
I think you're right. I know you're right. I agree.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, well, that's why I started this channel, is because I feel like so many people have a one-off experience with classical music and either throw it out the window or go, oh, that was like a nice thing to experience, like a friend of mine that was like, I want to go to the opera, I want to wear my tux. That's cool, but that's not what the opera is for. It's like, oh, I got to have this one cool classical music experience. Now on with the rest of my life, and not to say that that's so wrong. That's fine, but if we can just learn a little bit more and have things put in a way that it's understandable, then maybe we can all enjoy those things a little bit more.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I'll tell you, growing up, I thought opera was awful.
Me too.
I thought it was an awful thing. And I'll tell you why. My grandmother, my father's mother, loved opera.
Oh, really?
And you have to go back to her era, mid 20th century, where opera for her, she never saw an opera on stage, but she listened religiously to all the radio broadcasts of the Met.
Wow.
She collected programs. I still have a whole notebook of programs she pasted to pages and collected.
Wow.
But my growing up experience with opera was this tinny radio sound of what I thought were women and men howling and screeching.
Right.
And it made no sense to me. Why? Well, I wasn't paying attention to the story. I had no visual experience. Opera is not just listening to a song on the radio.
Right.
And it wasn't until I got to college that the door opened for me and said, this is okay. And that's when I had the opportunity for study abroad. And the study abroad was a 1-month experience where the entire purpose was to travel to all these different major cities in Europe and go to the major opera houses in each city and experience opera firsthand. And so I saw Carmen at the Grand Theater in Paris as the first opera I ever really experienced.
Right.
And it overwhelmed me. First of all, that theater is overwhelming.
Right.
I don't know if you've ever been there, but it's so huge. They had 4 horses pulling a wagon through there and other horses galloping around, 75 children dancing in another corner. And I go, how did they do this?
Right.
Yeah. And so it became a whole different experience. And I realized this is not just that tinny voice over the radio. It's something broader. And, so I don't write off opera like I had been. But, but if somebody says, would you listen to this recording of an opera? I'll probably walk out of the room because it's not going to mean that much to me. I'd rather have the whole thing.
Right, right.
And not that I can't imagine, I could, but I'd rather not sit and listen to the recording.
Well, it sounds like you have a very specific experience with just listening to the recording, so that makes sense. And I think that's something to keep in mind is that we've all had our very unique experiences with, our childhood encounters with various things, and that's still going to be a part of us. But it doesn't mean that that's it. There's always so much more if you can just dare to open that door a bit more.
Sure.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right.
So at least we'll get you in the opera seats.
Oh yeah. Well, Opera Theater St. Louis, I tend to go to those performances as much as I can.
Yeah. No,
I don't see them all, but I've seen some great productions there.
They do a great job. They bring in some great
and one of my all-time hits is Dialogue of the Carmelites. Not because it's an opera that's uplifting, it's really tragic, but because the drama and the storytelling and everything is so good. So anyway.
Oh, absolutely. That's one of my absolute favorites. Well, great. I think we covered a whole lot of territory. Is there anything else that you wanted to share or any final thoughts?
I don't have any magic pearls coming out of my head right now to say. In fact, that's one of those questions you always hate to be asked.
Well, that's totally fine. I think you have shared so much with us, and I'm really so grateful for you taking the time. And thanks for letting me share your piece. I'm really excited to. It's a really fun piece, and I'm excited for everybody to get to hear it. And just thank you so much. It's really been a blast just to catch up with you.
All right. Well, it's been a pleasure.
Yes.
Talking to you. Thank you for doing this.
Yes. Thank you for being here. Very excited.
Yeah. And Mozart, I'll see more and hear more from you, I'm sure. All right. Well, is this where we say goodbye?
Yeah, I suppose so.
Okay. Well, bye.
Bye.
I'm going to go find what's next.
Yes, on to what's next.
Okay. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Tuba
that's what we got today. Thank you so much to Bob for taking the time to chat with us and to let us know a little bit about your process. It was really a delight to get to chat with you. And thank you to Markus, Kaitila, and Joe Exley. It was great to get to work through these pieces with you. Thank you so much for your beautiful musicianship. And thank you to you all for watching. Please be sure to like, comment, subscribe, push all the fun buttons, including that little notification bell so you don't miss our next video. And we will